is the strategy's toolkit adequately equipped for this task? What are the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic? And how does the current development caused by Russia's invasions of Ukraine affect EU's industrial policies? We are very grateful to have Kerstin Jorna here together with Jan-Olof Jacke and Flam to further discuss these issues here today at SNS. A very warm welcome to all of you. Kerstin Jorna is Director-General at the Directorate-General for Internal Market, Industry, Enterprise and Small and Medium Enterprises, GROW, in the European Commission. Jan-Olof Jacke is Director-General at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprises, Svenskt Näringsliv. And Flam is Professor Emeritus at the Institute for International Economic Studies at the Stockholm University and Senior Advisor at Sieps, the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies, where he recently wrote a report on the European industrial strategy. And this seminar is a collaboration between SNS and the European Commission's representation in Stockholm, for which we are very happy. So my name is Ilinca Benson. I'm Deputy CEO here at SNS, and I have the honor of chairing this meeting. A very warm welcome to all of you who are here, and also to all of you who are following us and participating digitally. And I would really encourage you to contribute to the discussion with your questions and comments during the seminar. And that goes for you who are here. Then you can simply raise your hand during the panel discussion, and you will get a microphone and can ask a question. And for you who are with us digitally, you can write your questions down whenever you want in the Q&A function, and then my colleague Nina will pick them up during the panel discussion and present them to our speakers. Yes, and also this is very important for you who write your questions, please keep them short and to the point so that we will have time for them. But now I would really like to invite you, Kerstin Jorna, up on the SNS stage. I think maybe it's the last thing that you do now during your visit in Sweden. Maybe not, but it will be very interesting to hear the latest update on the industrial strategy. Very welcome.
Thank you very much. And let me start with one sentence. Industrial policy is not a foul word. And I hope that I'll be able to show to you how much we need industrial policy in the single market. And I'd like to focus on two elements why we need it. The first is to walk the talk on the twin transition. The twin transition meaning digitizing our procedures, our operations of our companies, and greening and decarbonizing the way we produce and the way we consume. And the second I'd like to talk about is single market in the face of crisis. Why it is so important to know your supply chain. If I go to the first point, twin transition, we need to walk the talk on this. And I know for sure we cannot regulate ourselves out of the twin transition from an office in Brussels or anywhere for that matter. We need companies to invest, to have the right projects. Yesterday I saw sustainable mining projects, recycling projects of raw materials. I heard about steel, green steel. So we need these projects to happen. And we cannot see them happen somewhere, somewhen. We need to see them happen now, which means rolling out innovation much faster than, scaling it up much faster, because we want to be there in 2030, minus 55 emissions. And we need, in order to do that, we need a business case for the companies. Now, what is a business case? It means you have the technology. It means you have your inputs, the raw materials, other inputs. It means you have the skills, workers being able to actually do this. For example, on batteries, we know until 2030, we are lacking 800,000 people who actually can deal with batteries. We have to train them. What's the solution here? We need the right regulation to accompany this. for example, standards on how batteries have to look in order to also protect the investments that will be made. And we need the markets, because somebody has to buy the green steel. And what does the single market and EU industrial policy have to do with it? It's bringing out the business case, is understanding where actually we're still lacking. For example, hydrogen. We know hydrogen will be part of the solution of the future. It means we need to produce it, we need to transport it, we need to store it, and we need to use it. Now, there's quite a lot of activity on producing hydrogen, so the supply side, electrolyzers, and there's quite a lot of activity also on using hydrogen, for example, green steel, and there are two emblematic projects in the north of Sweden, but hydrogen is produced where the sun is. Industry is where yesterday's energy was, coal, for example. So you need to be able to transport it. Now, what we know is that hydrogen transport, we haven't even had the technology. We don't have the full technology yet how to transport it. And we don't have the full technology yet how to store it. How do we get people to invest into this? It's by giving the right incentives. It's by de-risking the operation. Now, on the technology, you can de-risk by promoting research, and that's where public money comes in. When it comes to market risk and certain solutions, it's with standards that we can work. So we are developing a standard strategy, and we are super fast tracking, for example, the standards on how to transport and store hydrogen. And then on the use of hydrogen, there are still a number of issues to be solved, in particular in chemical operations, and in steel and cement. So that we also have to help. So it's really about the business case. And how do we go about it? We're looking not at 27 economies and all of them going green. We're looking at 14 industrial ecosystems in the single market, and they range from tourism to renewables to mobility to aerospace. And we're looking at these ecosystems that include the technology, the universities, the startups, the scale-ups, the suppliers, the workers, the producers, the consumers, the markets, civil society. We're looking at each of these 14 ecosystems to understand what does it take to get to what's your target to get to 2030, and what does it take to get there? What's your business case here? And we start the process by drafting what we call a scenario. So we put together all the information that we have about, the 5 elements of the business case, and we are trying to validate them, and then we are trying to identify the gaps. And one area where we identify a lot of gaps actually is raw materials. For example, magnets. Magnets you need for any turbine. They are very relevant for renewable energy, in particular wind energy. And these magnets, they're composed of rare earths. Now, we found that we depend to almost 99% on rare earth from China. That's not a healthy dependency. And I can say a word about dependencies after. So it's not a healthy dependency. How do we make sure that we kind of have more of this in Europe and are sure, whilst we are scaling, the wind parks, that we will have these magnets? One way is to recycle rare earth from the turbines, because the first generation of turbines, they are coming, they have to be replaced, and we're shipping them, everything together, to lock, stock and barrel to China. That's stupid. So we should recycle. But when it comes to recycling, we have to understand how to do it. And I saw great technology in the northern Sweden, where actually we are recycling rare earths from the waste of mining. And that operation in itself could already provide 30% of our needs on magnets and rare earth. Another example is batteries, lithium. Now, we've been importing the lithium, but we don't know if with the increased demand for lithium and batteries across the globe, we'll be able to access. Now, lithium is one of the materials that we actually have in Europe. And now 2 countries, Portugal and Spain, have come together to actually move from coal to lithium, to move from old energy to new energy, and create also the refining and value chain. And that's being supported by our next generation EU budget. So this is around the input. I do want to say a word about the skills, because what we find in this work on the transition pathways, we find that we're lacking a lot of skills. Between now and 2030, for example, mobility, all these engineers and who know combustion engines, how it's very different to do the battery. And it's important to identify these skills gaps because before you're confronted with them. So we are having what we call pacts for skills as part of these transition pathways. And these pacts for skills bring together the companies and the workers' representations. And they sit together, it's kind of moderated by the Commission, but they sit together and they identify the skills they need for the future. And they also identify the money it takes to get the skills for the future. And they identify how to get there. We've created together a battery academy that trains 150,000 people every year. We're thinking of something similar also for hydrogen. So in order to really make sure that we address all the gaps that we see together and that we use the scale of the single market to do this. I want to say a last word on dependencies. So 3 months ago, China said, sorry, we have no magnesium for you anymore. Semiconductors is very much on everybody's mind, but the magnesium, nobody had it on their mind. And magnesium, you need to build, you know, the metal part of the car. It's an alloy. Now, China just stopped giving us the magnesium. It was a business case in the past to get your magnesium from China, cheap, you didn't care about the CO2, but it's really problematic when you don't have it anymore. And that's a real disruption. So now we're working with 7 member states who actually have magnesium mines that were no longer a business model, and see whether they could, you know, pick up part of the operation, because it's a real disruption here. It's not a question of being the price very high. It's just we don't have it. Nobody has it anymore, the magnesium. And the last point on the renewable energies, because that will be key in many of our ecosystems to have the renewable energy enough for it. Yesterday, when I was in the north of Sweden, only one mining company for greening their operation with amazing technology, they need 50 terawatt per year. That's more or less half, I think, of what Sweden, or a third of the Swedish energy consumption today. So how do we create it? There is the issue of creating it in the first place, wind and solar, hydro maybe, but there is also the issue of how you ensure the base load, because what do you do when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow? And that's where the hydrogen comes in. There is also the issue of the grid. You know, what grids do you go for grid electricity? Do you go for decentralized, you know, every rooftop a solar panel? But if I look at solar panels, we have today in Europe the technology that's much better than what the Chinese produce, because we have a much better wafers, much better you know, output of the solar panels. But we are not scalable at the moment. We haven't scaled that industry, which means that if we create this huge demand for renewable energy, we create a new dependency on solar panels from China. So let's think about it. Let's think about it with the US, who have actually a similar problem as we have. And in the solar power panel value chain, they have certain capabilities, we have certain capabilities. There might be a way to work together on this. So this is the first point I wanted to make about EU industrial policy being the single market accelerator for the green and digital business case. My second point is about the single market in the crisis. What we see with this aggression in Ukraine today, and the combination of the aggression, the collusion between Russia and Belarus, the sanctions, we see that we are very successful in destabilizing the Russian economy, which is good, because that will make sure that they don't have the money or not enough money to finance this horrendous war. But there's also an impact on the European economy. And that's where we need to stabilize the economy. Now, what do we see? We see that the channel for destabilization comes through two aspects, two channels. The first is inputs. Certain inputs from Russia and Belarus are no longer coming. Gas only being the most prominent, but there are others. There are certain steel products, there's palladium, which you need for catalysts. There are noble gases which came from Ukraine, from the plant that was bombarded in Mariupol, which is two shatters. There may be food. So inputs missing. And the second transmission channel is export markets, no longer for our companies. So what do we do about it? The first is that we try to understand what's actually going on in the supply chains, because for a long time, we haven't really worried about supply chains. You know, it was happening. It was global trade and the things were coming. One very with big responsibilities person from one ecosystem said to me, yeah, I don't know where the microchips come from, actually. I don't know where they, so that's, we have to understand. So we are working with the industry now to have a better insight into the supply chains. You know, where do the different things come from? What's the price evolution? And we're working with different data points, including also from industry. And I think on behalf of, you know, for the European industries, to understand what's going on. And then the question is how these two destabilizing channels, how we work with them. For example, wood. There is a problem shortage now of plywood, and there's a shortage of hardwood. That means that certain companies that produce for the construction sector, that produce furniture, they cannot work anymore because they don't have the inputs. Can we organize the value chain and help the companies to reorganize their value chains in Europe in order to be able to access at least part of these inputs? The other thing is export markets. Again, can we organize the value chains in a different way between interested companies to make sure that at least some of their products can still be sold? We had a pilot with this for Lithuanian companies who were suffering from Chinese coercion. And that actually worked quite well. So you could see the single market acted actually like a life vest for in this situation. A last point finally on where does all of this take us? So I said single market as the accelerator for the business case for the green and digital transition, and single market as the life vest. We will propose for in a couple of months a single market emergency instrument that will draw the lessons from everything that we've seen in the two crises, the COVID crisis and the current crisis, which will have a preparatory module somehow about understanding better, being able to anticipate supply chain crunches and problems, and then kind of more on the crisis. When there is a crisis, you know, how should we govern it? How do we keep our borders open? How do we stabilize our economy? Do we need some stockpiling for some critical materials to be able to organize that at the European level? One element on the crisis management, also born from what we witnessed, is joint procurement. Because what we saw in the beginning of the COVID crisis was that member states started to bid against each other for the vaccines. And that was the end of solidarity and the end of the single market that could have been. Because if the highest bidder could you know, just take it all. So we proposed that it was the Commission to procure jointly for all in the interest of the member states. And that joint procurement had many advantages. That the advantage that we are not artificially raising the prices, that we had quite a big negotiating power, that we had the budget, because the EU budget helped to advance it, what national budgets would not have been able to do on this scale, and that the that we could use the power and the analysis of our scientific services to actually choose the right vaccines from the 107, the 6 right ones from the 170 that were happening. It also helped us to then build the industrial production chain, because the contracts were with the companies that invented the vaccines, but there was no industrial production behind it. So we could bring together the different companies with the different capabilities, and to build, including the cold logistics chain, to actually build the whole chain and to increase from 25 million doses per month to more than 300 that we have now, and to allow us to produce for everyone. And we've just proposed this also as a possibility for gas, joint procurement of gas in this particular crisis. So industrial policy is not a foul word. It's a concept that we need to bring together and to bring out the power of the single market in order to be successful with the green and digital transition, and to make sure that in the situation of crisis, it's like a life vest, like a life jacket to protect our companies, our economy. And the net result of it, I believe, will be very much competitiveness of our industries. Thank you very much.
Kerstin, please stay on the stage for a bit. Thank you very much for those introductory remarks. And I would like to begin by asking you a question about, you said that you gave this example of the renewables and solar panels that we haven't really scaled up in the proper way within Europe. What are the biggest barriers to scaling up an industry such as the solar panel industry in Europe today, would you say?
It's the business case. If you look at the 8 or 9 steps in the solar panel value chain, and you look at the 10 biggest companies, you have 9 times 10 Chinese companies, except one on the wafers, on the polysilicon, sorry, and that's a German company. So we're no longer there in the solar panel value chain. We only have the better technology. We have a number of companies who have actually really developed new technology. And that was the same picture we had on the batteries. So on the batteries, at a certain stage, we said, no, we are going to go for European production. Northvolt was the first one. We now have 20 gigafactories in Europe. We're probably will be exporting batteries. We're a world leader in battery technology. We're now at the stage of having the first totally recyclable battery. So we've turned it around. And I think on solar panels, that's the way to follow as well. The Commission will propose a solar strategy still before the summer. And it's the same approach as we do for hydrogen. It's bring together supply, demand, the technology, the investors, to create visibility for investors as well, to come in and scale this technology much faster than like we see now. It's really replicating the battery model.
Okay. Do we have any questions from now? And do we have any questions now? You have time later as well, but do you have any questions now for the Director-General? No. Then please have a seat, and I will welcome up Professor Harry Flam and Jan-Olof Jacke on stage. And I will first give the word to you, Harry, the research perspective on the industrial strategy.
Mm-hmm. Well, EU industrial policy has become much more interventionist or active in recent years. It used to be the case that the industrial policy, to the extent it was called industrial policy, was about making the single market work better, to eliminate still existing barriers to trade and the movement of different factors of production and so on. and not to promote specific sectors or industries. Now, in recent years, the policy has become, as I said, much more active. And the most concrete examples of this is what is called industrial alliances, where the Commission brings together politicians, organizations, industries, etc., around certain projects, and also what is called the important projects of common European interest. And these are organized in sectors where the Commission and industry and other interested parties think are important and strategically important sectors or industries. For example, microeconomics, microelectronics in general, and particularly in semiconductors, rare earth metals that you mentioned, such as cobalt and others, and in hydrogen, batteries, etc., etc. And this recent development is quite understandable because we look at China. China has been very successful in advancing their industry. They're become quite advanced in many sectors. And we see that this is to a large extent dependent on very extensive large government subsidies to industry, particularly in sectors that they think are strategic. And the same thing is now happening in the United States. The Congress passed a law last year, and the United States will spend very large amounts on strategic sectors. Now, there is an academic case for supporting certain industries and certain sectors if we see market failures in certain areas. And there are various kinds of market failures, and this is particularly true for research and development, but less so for commercial activities such as manufacturing. Now, the European Union now has embarked on a more active policy where state subsidies will go to certain sectors and certain industries. And I see a clear risk here that it will all end up in very costly projects and possibly in costly failures for taxpayers. And let me take two examples. One example is the case for semiconductors. The plan here is to support research, development, and manufacturing so that European industry can catch up with competitors in Asia and in the United States, and to decrease Europe's dependence on imports from Asia. Asia supplies about 80% of all semiconductors that are used. And in particular, dependence on Taiwan, they support about 60% of all semiconductors. Now, all this requires enormous amounts of investments. We know that Taiwanese and South Korean producers plan to invest in the next few years about $200 billion in semiconductor development and manufacturing. And the US government will now allocate in grants to research, development, and manufacturing more than $50 billion in the next 5 years. So here we have an investment of at least $250 billion going to this sector. There is a clear risk here that the expansion of production in semiconductors worldwide will end up in an excess capacity of semiconductors. And in fact, if we look back at the history of this industry, it is marked by periods of excess capacity, and not, as we've seen in the recent past, in the past year or so, post-COVID, excess demand for semiconductors. Another example is batteries for vehicles. At present, there are plans for about 40 gigafactories for battery production. A gigafactory is a factory that is able to produce 1 gigabyte of battery capacity per year. And there are, if I'm not wrong, about 27 gigafactories that are either being built or planning or in the planning stage that are wholly or partially financed by private capital. If we look at the plans to increase capacity for battery production in Europe and the projections of demand, it seems as if by 2030, we will have an excess capacity in Europe of about 100%. So capacity will be about twice as large as demand. Now, I don't think this will happen because, of course, investors in these factories will look at the development and lots of that capacity will never be realized. Now, so my point here is not to argue against any support to industry and sectors that we think are strategically important, such as battery, semiconductors, and other sectors. But it's to argue that if we support these sectors, it should go to research and development and not to commercial activities such as manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you. Jan-Olof.
Thank you. I've been scribbling down here as I've listened, so sorry if I'm a little unstructured. But first of all, I would like to start by saying that the importance of a structured and constructive dialogue like this cannot be overestimated. I think it's critically important. I think we stand at somewhat of a crossroad. There is a lot of pressure on increased joint borrowing, on more of a top-down approach. And I don't think, or we don't think, that is necessarily the right way forward. I think it has the risk of weakening our position as a global player. So we are quite convinced that market solutions are best suited to delivering the twin transition that was referred to. However, we should obviously not say things are good as they are, and therefore we should just continue. Politics has a huge role to play, and I very much agree with Professor Flam's comment around where money needs to go in. It needs to go into research, development, and particularly research, the early phases. The scale up, for good ideas, there will be funding coming to good investment opportunities. The second is education. It was referred to as the skills gap. Obviously, the public sector has a significant contribution to make into the skills gap. Over lunch, we discussed the huge lack of data scientists, for instance. What can we do to drive that between industry and the public sector? And the largest contribution politics can make is the removal of obstacles. I really like the expression, Kerstin, that you used, that was bring out the power of the single market. We couldn't possibly agree more. I think that is number one. The more we can create a single market with similar conditions, the better. It will drive our competitiveness. Customers will put the pressure on the green transition. I have no doubt about that. That's why it's so key that in this difficult situation for Europe, we must not lose the focus on the green transition. The rest of the world will continue to move on in this direction, and there is a big risk now that we look at energy prices. We look at Germany starting to start up coal energy rather than and continuing to close down the kärnkraft, nuclear power, which I found relatively remarkable, I have to say. Energy is the absolute key. Green energy and fossil-free energy is the absolute key to the transition of climate. And I think we need to keep the pressure very high on the pace of climate transition. And then we need to significantly, in Sweden, and I'm sure in the rest of Europe, significantly increase our investment into the transmission of energy. We need to speed up significantly, at least half the lead times of permissions. It takes far too long time, and it doesn't match at all with the ambition level we have for 2030. And we need to remove obstacles for new investment in energy production. One of the most important obstacles we have in Sweden is the clear statement on renewable, but still we say that you can invest in anything that is fossil-free. That's legal, it is. But who would do it? And what is the risk premium you get when you have so dual messages? I think that's not acceptable. Obviously, this is now more urgent than ever. The current situation in Russia and Ukraine makes the whole energy transition situation and challenge even bigger, even more urgent. And whilst it was primarily a discussion on what do we need to do over the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's now very much a discussion around what do we need to do here and now. And it has become much, much more of a pricing issue rather than the long-term supply issue. I think any discussion around industrial strategy has to take its starting point. You mentioned it has to result in competitiveness. I think it's so critical that we take the starting point of competitiveness in any part of an industrial strategy. I will finish off by saying that I think there is a tendency at the moment to make technological choices at political level. That means you will allocate investments to certain technologies. I think that's a dangerous way. I think, however, we need to be pragmatic to the current situation. We need to be pragmatic to what you call market failures. However, we must be very, very cautious to not make that a principle, but rather an extreme exception. Politics should remove obstacles, create as big single market as possible, focus on research and development and education, and then market solutions will cater for the real transition.
Thank you, Jan-Olof, and very welcome back, Kerstin. Maybe, Harry, if you move one step, and during that time, Kerstin, you will take the stage again. And now, of course, I would like you to reflect on the remarks by Harry and Jan-Olof, and maybe you can start with Harry's rather blunt statement that this project have the risk of being costly and failing as well, with the examples of semiconductors and batteries. What are your reflections on Harry's analysis?
I don't quite agree, because what we're not talking about just taking public money and throwing it at companies. The new strategy we have, and we've had it ever since the Juncker Fund, is to de-risk. So I've worked in investment before. So if you look at a project, you look at the risk. There are different types of risk. There's the technology risk. Will it work or not? That's where the research maybe can help. But there's a clear scale-up risk as well, because I will not invest in your technology, even if you've shown it in the lab that it works, if you can't show that you can scale it. So you would say, okay, I will make a demonstrator. I will show to you how it works. Then I'll give you a bit money to do your demonstrator. Then maybe you will be successful. And then I will ask you, where are your clients? And you will say to me, well, I haven't looked at them yet. And then I will consider this is a market risk. So I'm not giving you any money anymore. And we don't have time, at least for the green and digital transition, we don't have time to do it that way. Where we need to look at is the project, and we need to look at the project from the supply to the commercial use. And de-risking also means, for example, industrial standards. When I see for example, on the storage of hydrogen, today we don't actually know how to store it. Today we don't know either what type of purity of hydrogen you need for green steel, for example. So we cannot wait until this is kind of all figured out. We need to do it at the same time, because if we wait until all of this is there, then meanwhile the steel, they will have their next investment cycle and they will again do the blast furnace. They will not do the electric arc. So that's why I think we need collectively, and this is what industrial policy in Europe is about, we need to look at the risk of the whole value chain. And then we need to look at who bears what risk. And what the public money can do is, maybe in the research and education, I agree. What regulation and standards can do is further removed from the scale up. And we can also, with our kind of trade defense instruments, CBAM, for example, we can also make sure that the companies have the breathing time to invest in these new technologies and applying them. So it's really about de-risking, and everybody has a skin in the game: the companies, the investors, the public. And that will make sure that we have the right projects and that we get it right in this transition, rather than, you know, just throwing a lot of money at something we don't need.
Harry, would you like to comment?
Well, the EU tried industrial policy. There was a popular phase in the late 70s and the 80s to promote industrial policy. No, thank you. And I remember that one sector that the EU looked at was high definition television, which is not the technology that shakes the earth these days. And in fact, most Japanese companies have left the game long ago. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a clear risk that you jump aboard because this is a ship that happens to be passing, like battery. I mean, it's obvious that to have battery cars, we need batteries. So this is very much the topic these days. And of course, the private capital and the Commission is very interested in getting battery capacity in Europe, because we are lagging behind South Korea and China. But in this case, I think that private capital already sees a very strong business case for battery production in Europe. So I don't think there's much need for taxpayers' money to go into that industry. As for semiconductors, China has been trying to develop a semiconductor industry for a long time, about 20 years. And so far, they haven't succeeded. They have about, I think, 17% of semiconductor production in the world, and they still are not very technologically advanced. In fact, there is one Taiwanese company that has half of the world's production. So it requires enormous scale and enormous investments. Now, we're doing this because there was an excess demand last year after COVID, and we can point at some reasons why we had this excess demand. But if you look back, we've had excess capacity also at times in this industry. And we're doing it for another reason. We don't want to be dependent on Asia for semiconductors. And I'm a little bit worried about this current reasoning that we shouldn't be too dependent. I mean, it's very popular these days to say that we have to diversify the supply chains. But on the other hand, it's free trade, and trade, specialization that has given us the standard of living that we have today. So, yeah, so I'm a little bit questioning.
Would you like to come in, Kerstin?
Yes, I'd like to come in. HDTV. Everybody can be wrong. I'm sure you've been wrong in your research as well at times. I don't have
maybe
the example.
Not at the same cost.
I don't have the example now, but yes, we were possibly wrong. But that doesn't mean that when you see the challenges ahead of you, you can try to improve and make it better. That also is innovation principle. On the excess capacity, I don't think it's I think it makes us very vulnerable to depend on one big factory in one place in the world. That's not sustainable and resilient business model to depend on one. I mean, all those who depended on this one and don't have microprocessors anymore, all those who depended on the magnesium and don't, all of a sudden are confronted with the fact they don't have it anymore. I think we need to change the way we think about supply chains, because the way we think about it now, and it's on purpose that I quoted this one anecdote, people think global trade means things fall from sky on my table when I need it. But that's an illusion. And we've seen that it's an illusion. So let's maybe move to things, what I need. I know I can get it there and there and there. And by the way, I know what I'll need in the future. This is the whole question about the raw materials that we need. I mean, who was talking about magnets a couple of even months ago? Now we realize, in order to do all these windmills, we need the magnets. And that means we need the rare earths. And where actually are they? They're in China. And China might do the same thing as they did on the magnesium. Sorry, we have no rare earth for you. So let's be prepared for that situation.
Jan-Olof, I would like to let you into the conversation as well.
A couple of comments. One is, I think there is a point regarding pace, because pace will be of absolute essence here. But it's clear that some of these supply chains have come from the huge economies of scale. And obviously, if you don't match the price over time, you will stand with a stranded asset. And that's a very, very clear risk if you go into having market disturbances. But I think it's clear that the last few years have been wake-up calls for companies in terms of supply chains. It's when we look or talk to our companies, and just in a survey that we haven't even presented yet, it's clear that what do you do to compensate? You increase your stock levels. You have more suppliers. You have suppliers closer to you. But the key question for me here is, who is best placed to define how to change your supply chains? I think the force from companies here who have come to this wake up call during pandemic will do it again now. It will change supply chains. And I think companies are really well positioned to best understand what is good for their future, rather than politics saying this is how you should change your supply chain.
I totally agree. But, when it comes to raw materials, we may have an idea where we want to get it from, but the Chinese will be there before us with a big bag of money. And that's where policy can help to open channels to have a better conversation.
And politics can remove obstacles from opening new mines, from and reducing the lead times for getting permission to open new mines. We know in Sweden, for instance, we have huge mineral reserves, but we are not allowed to get it out on the ground. So I think politics play a significant role in the pace and the speed of this change.
Yeah. Kerstin, would you like to comment on that, Jan-Olof's initial comment on the role of the EU within this to remove barriers rather than to promote actively different investments and markets?
It's not either or rather than. We have to do everything at the same time, because the single market must be the accelerator. And that means not just, barriers or not, it means having an output, being decarbonized by 2030 and having these new and competitive business models by 2030. So removing barriers, I'd like to mention two things here. One is the permitting. We are currently looking at permitting. We've made a study, which we haven't totally released yet because we are validating with the member states, but we looked at the procedures for permitting for renewables, I have to say, not the mining, but for renewables installations in the different member states. The picture is rather shocking, I have to say, because over time, member states have built processes which includes different stakeholders in kind of millefeuille way. So they all contribute, they all have their silo, there's no holistic view, and there's also a lot of bureaucracy around it. But member states did it in very different ways. So already you can compare that, you know, for achieving the same objectives, some have towers of procedures, others have shorter procedures.
Are there some countries that are sort of better that we can?
I'm not able to say that at this moment, but what we are looking at is now we have a single market enforcement task force that removes barriers, not barriers that are a violation of community law. It's not about the compliance and I play the sheriff story. It's really about, it's the economy story. So why are these barriers kind of hampering the twin transition? And where this year we are zooming in on the permitting issues. And before you say, well, good intentions, nice. Last year we zoomed in on the engineer and following the machine issue. So the services and the recognition of qualifications issue. We had identified same procedure, 800 barriers, not conducive in the member states. And we've given ourselves, with the 77 member states, the objective of reducing half of it. We're now at 300 removed. And we're looking at electronics instead of paper. We're looking at timelines to announce, you know, if I'm an engineer and I have to maintain a machine, I do not know 2 weeks before that the machine will break down, obviously. So I cannot announce myself 2 weeks before. So this type of thing we're removing, and I'm quite confident that we'll be removing a lot of permitting bureaucracy in any event with this exercise.
Harry, I noted that you want to have the word, but we have a question from the audience. Can you please raise your hand so that Angelica knows that and say who you are?
My name is Ola Hansen. I'm from a company called H2 Green Steel. I have a comment first. I think we talked about market failures, and I think one failure in the global market is to price in the cost of climate emissions and environmental impact. So I think it clearly is a case for the European Union to put policies and measures that price this in. I think it's great. And we mentioned batteries here. It's not only that we now have battery production, we have battery production that is much more sustainable than in the rest of the world. And I think that we have the battery regulation soon to be in place that really sets a level. You can't put batteries on the European market if they have a certain carbon footprint higher than a certain number, which, I mean, secures a really sustainable production. So that was a comment. I think the question is to Directorate Jorna here. I think you talked about CBAM here and phasing out free allocation, putting a price on carbon in Europe, and the high ambition on climate, which is crucial for us going forward. Do you think there's a risk that ambition will be lower now with this current situation in Ukraine, or will you keep the same ambition or maybe even strengthen it?
Please.
I think it will strengthen our ambition because it makes the case why we cannot be dependent on fossil fuel and how important it is to wean off and be less dependent on fossil fuel. And that means fuel input, but that also means how we use it. And green steel or steel production is a case in point. So I think it will accelerate the movement, and it will accelerate the need to scale and to tackle all the risks at the same time and not wait from the careful investor point of view. First risk dealt with, second risk, we will have to de-risk at the same time. And that's the challenge, really.
Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Oh, we have one more.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Stefan Sagebro. I'm from the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. So thank you for this very interesting discussion that we had so far. I have a question on the ecosystems. 14 ecosystems that the Commission has sort of divided the economy in. Do you foresee any need to review and perhaps revise these this division of the economy into 14 ecosystems in the future, because they are perhaps not the only way to look at the economy? Thank you.
So the 14 ecosystem, it's not a religion. Before we looked at 27 national economies, and then we thought the 27 together is the single market. But what that type of glasses did not show us was the effect of the single market and the kind of the integration of the single market. And add to that the experience of COVID, when the Germans wanted to absolutely invested a lot of money to keep their car producers open and the people in job. And they had nothing to do because the spare parts or whatever parts they needed were coming from Slovakia and Czechia, where the companies were not open and did not produce. So what you have to understand in order to enhance the single market and the size of the single market is how the ecosystems work between the different, between the suppliers, as I said, technology, university, technology, scale up, startup, and all the rest. And it's not a religion. I mean, we chose these ones because they are the biggest ones. I mean, the 14 together, they make up something like 95% of the value added. But what we see is, for example, in the energy intensive industries ecosystem, that the chemical sector has additional problems because they do not only have the digitization and the decarbonization and green, they also have the greening part with the sustainable chemical strategy. So they have to substitute a number of products that are too risky in our analysis. So they have a triple transition to do. And that's why on the transition pathway, we're looking at a mini transition pathway for them specifically. So it's to understand better the 14. It's like, you know, Googles that you put on to understand better. It's not a religion. So we're very flexible also in the discussions with the stakeholders.
Thank you. And Harry?
I was intrigued by your remark about solar panels. Apparently you're planning to present something before the summer. Now, it used to be that European producers were the most efficient producers of solar panels. If you go back before 2005 or so, Siemens was one of them. And now you say that there is technology in Europe that is much better. It's much higher yield for solar panels. Why don't they invest in that technology? And
they do. They do. But they scale up not fast enough. If I look at the demand that we have from, that we will have, you know, imagine every rooftop needs a solar panel, we create a demand for China. And we create a demand for not so efficient solar panels from China, whilst the others take time to scale. It's again, I come back to your point about the pace. How can we scale the pace?
Another reflection there. The price of solar panels when China started to produce them fell by about 2/3. So we have been able to import to consume solar panels for about 1/3 of the price that it costs to produce them in Europe. That's a good thing.
If you look at how they're produced, I think it's a bad thing.
I'm not aware of how they're produced, but but it's basically Chinese taxpayers who are paying part of our consumption of solar panels.
We have a strong issue of forced labor in that as well.
Okay.
Jan-Olof, I would like to give you the opportunity to proceed on your wish list here when we have the Director-General. Well, we touched on permits. What other obstacles are important to be removed?
Well, I think several of them are also national. And we are probably, you said earlier that we are possibly not world leading in gold plating. Maybe there is one country ahead of us, but we are far too good in gold plating. So many of our obstacles are also national. But I will want to come back to the bring out the power of the single market. And one of the most important things I think we can do there is also to continue to drive new free trade agreements. The more we can expand our network of free trade agreements, the better it is for the single market. Another part on the wish list, which I think is probably a bit of a wishful thinking, but we would love to have a global price on carbon. However, this would probably not happen in anytime soon. And then we want obviously to have as common situation in Europe as possible to make the market as fair as possible. We are cautiously positive to the CBAM, but I think one should be realizing that it comes also with some consequences. It will not be possible over time to have CBAM and free allowances, and that will make our competitiveness outside of EU more difficult. But the point is, the larger economies with the same degree of regulations, the more fair play, the better it is. So if you continue to push hard for a global price on carbon, it's a good start.
I will give a short final remark to you, Kerstin, before we have to wrap it up.
Final remark. If you retain single market as life vest and single market as accelerator for the green and digital transition, then I think we've kind of redefined the single market. We'll have 30 years of single market this year and next year. It will be a main topic under the Swedish presidency. And the single market is a peace project. With Delors, it became a kind of essentially legal project as well on top of it. And now we need it to be the transformation project for the next 10, 20 years. And this is where we need to all collaborate. And it's not only the Commission or only governments or only industry. It needs to work together. And we have a scale up and pace issue here. And I hope we can work together.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Director-General Kerstin Jorna, Harry Flam, and Jan-Olof Jacke. And thank you also for all of you for coming here and contributing with your questions and comments. And before I let you go, I would like to recommend you a seminar on a related topic that we have in May on the market conditions and regulations for investment in new nuclear power, which has become topical. And also I would like to recommend you to look into SNS Samhällsprogram, which is an intensive executive educational program that teaches you everything you need to know about governance on local, national, and the EU level, which we host every fall. And with those words, have a nice weekend.